Aperture.
Thanks, Arthur, for introducing me. I see a lot of familiar faces tonight, and it means a lot to me. So it's fun to be introduced by somebody that I've known for a long time. Um, and I was just saying to somebody that by the end of this talk, I will have said more about these pictures in the upcoming 45 minutes than I think I have discussed them over the last 15 years of making them. So knowing that, I thought I would make this less of an artist talk and more like a podcast interview. So get ready for my origin story. Uh, this is a picture that I made at Bard College in fall of '97, and I go back to this place because um, it, for me, it typifies a moment in photography and my own personal engagement in it, and large format film photography. I had transferred to Bard College because I wanted a BA rather than a BFA. And when I was a student there, when I applied, Larry Fink was the photographer who was sort of the star of the program. And if people don't know, he's still around and has a very tough street-style, black and white way of photographing the world. But the chair of the department was a photographer named Stephen Shore, who at that point I had never heard of. Yet he had a white-knuckle grip on the ideology that formed that undergraduate program and the vision for what it would be. And so while some of the ideas surrounding it cultivated a kind of, I would say, masculine and competitive environment just by nature of the equipment involved in this. So the downside is that you could form a boys' club around large format photography, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But what I loved about it is that it was the last time that I engaged with analog printing to this degree. We had catalogs of chemistry that we would pore over, and so in the darkroom, that's where the majority of the process would begin. So there was a certain amount of pre-visualization that would happen out in the field, but in that darkroom alone is where, and in the printing, that's where I think the work would really take shape. That said, what guided the aesthetics on the front end were very much indicative of that time. And what loomed large over the world of fine art photography was at least at Bard, was the new Topographic group of American photographers. And their European contemporaries, the Beschers and their students. And so what that meant as a young photographer is that you choose your subject, and your subject is almost an excuse to make a picture that you can bring back into the darkroom and handle and treat in a certain way. And so we were all out in overcast days and parking lots and looking at grimy circumstances, trying to emulate, in large part, what the new topographic photographers were doing, which was really embracing a kind of post-apocalyptic attitude towards what they saw as a sort of dystopian current state of our culture, at least in the way that it looked, and exposing the bones of that condition and culture. And this is a picture that comes straight out of that. And so I loved the texture of these mines and quarries. They really lent themselves well to the kind of equipment that I was using. And when I got to Bard, this was not something this is not the way I thought about making pictures. I'd just been out west for a while, and I think I fancied myself a traditionalist. And for me, engaging with the landscape was a kind of spiritual endeavor. And Stephen Shore did not respond to those pictures. He did not like the work that I was making. And one very formative moment was around this picture where we were sitting in his office alone, and he got this picture out. And for those of you that have seen the first season of Westworld, you will know that if you are a robot and you see it, you're confronted with evidence of that, it won't look like anything to you. And when he showed me this picture, I thought, this doesn't look like anything to me. This is chaos. It's a street corner, it's an intersection. And I understand that he's looking at that intersection, but the subject of the picture in no way spoke to me. And so with his finger, he guided me through the structure of the image, all of the interstices of the telephone poles, the windows, the way the verticals lined up, and the fact that the picture, at first glance, has a very shallow virtual space, meaning it looks like a graphic image on a page. But if you start with, say, that plaque in the foreground, and you allow your eye to be guided by the structure of the picture into the farther objects, you will sort of get the sensation in your head of your eyes refocusing, and that's the virtual space of the print that excited him. And he argued to me that pictures are not composed, that when a photographer becomes aware, they structure the pictures, they build them, and they do so with a kind of hyper-awareness. And this was a real epiphany for me, because it meant that the seeing was it. The seeing was the subject. And this is the picture of his that I come back to a lot, and it's somewhat ironic because this employs a much more conventional kind of one-point perspective composition, meaning the large, dark objects closest to you are on the sides of the frame, and as things recede, they get lighter out to the horizon. And because of the clarity of the camera that he was using, he is world building. There is a little boy in the window above that Volkswagen van that may be hard to see, but he may not have been aware of that child in the window when he made the picture, yet all of this is revealed later when he's printing it in the darkroom. And so when you see an 8x10 contact print of this, meaning if he one way to print this is to put the negative directly on the paper. And at that time, in what was essentially a pre-digital world, that was one of the most vivid things that you could see in the world. I had never seen the world rendered in that kind of clarity. Even blowing up an 8x10 print, I had not seen things rendered in such clarity. And it had an effect on me, but to engage with that is sort of like engaging in an arms race. You need a bigger camera, you need a sharper lens, and at some point you become entangled with the expense of equipment and material. And these are Andreas Gursky photographs, and this was sort of going on concurrently. This is the late 90s, and photography had kicked down the door and forced its way into the art world. And so it's commanding those prices and was commanding those sizes. And at the time, I think more than sure, we were all very excited about what someone like Gursky was doing, because he was engaging with spectacle in a way that Shore was not. So the picture on top is an early Gursky where you can see him with this kind of hyper-awareness, using the picture to create a kind of visual structure. And then at the bottom, a more recent picture, which is him really becoming more interested in spectacle. And I come back to Shore often because I think the bottom image now, looking at it, it feels somewhat disingenuous to me. And what I mean by that is, I think the artist statement that someone like Gursky employs is really the excuse to make the picture. Justifies the engagement with spectacle, and it made me always think engaging with spectacle alone is something that's interesting to me, and I think that engagement should justify itself. So fast forward 10 years later, and I was a student at the ICP-Bard program in its second year. It was run by an artist named Nayland Blake. I was vaguely aware of things as this period that I'm talking about in photography is essentially winding down. There were a few things on the periphery that I would come back to that were sort of outside of the artists that I was looking at or that we were talking about in class. It was a very conceptual program. And the image on the left is one of the few installation shots I could find online of a Julian Opie public art project in downtown Manhattan. And it's bisected there, two different locations, but the top one shows these figures walking at the top of the, I think, courthouse steps or something like that. And I would go down there and just watch people marvel at this thing. And it was, to see an artwork elicit just pure joy in someone off the street, that was almost a pejorative, I think, in the world that I was operating in at the moment. We didn't think about art or public art having that function. You know, this is, to me in New York, the problems of a Richard Serra sculpture obstructing your walk and blocking out the sun. These are the things that we were discussing. It's a Paul Pfeiffer image in the middle, where he would digitally remove the other players from a basketball court, and Peter Garfield image on the right, that's a model house that he was throwing up in the air. And these were just little things that I would kind of collect in a desktop folder. And I was finding it harder and harder in New York in a conceptually based program to figure out how to make pictures in the style that I wanted to and engage with the world and kind of keep up with what was happening in class. This is essentially a film still from the movie Bullet, and this is where Richard Prince gets the image on the left. It's a car chase scene. 1 in a million car chase scenes. But what I liked about it, not just the fact that I think car chases, when we were all kids once, and the car chase was never something that really furthered the plot. It was something that you expected, and it's its own kind of spectacle. But in looking in Prince's work, there were certain things that popped up from a particular point in our past. And these cars, I remembered them being around from when I was a kid, and not all of those associations were positive, because to be quite honest, if one of those was coming at you down the street and the guy inside is wearing a jean jacket with a Guns N' Roses patch on the back, you knew it was going to be trouble. So I didn't have a particularly positive association with this subject. I found the kind of redneck culture of the Dukes of Hazzard really abhorrent, and but I also was intrigued by this sort of UFO quality that I thought these cars embodied aesthetically. They looked to me like dinosaurs or UFOs or something that kind of existed on a parallel plane. And throughout my sort of varied practice, I've always tried to engage with subject matter like that. Zeppelins and airships, things that you can't believe existed in our timeline. And these cars, which were supercars then, they were really they're as inherently American as is the image of a cowboy. They were really made in direct response to the European sports car, which was completely attached to class, meaning that you needed a certain amount of money to buy one, and they were designed for European country roads, whereas the American counterpart was intended for teenagers to be able to drive off the lot and go race, go very fast in a short and straight line. They're essentially giant slabs of metal. And so I would get the camera out, and every now and then I would make pictures of these things, and I was struggling for a way to figure out how to find context for this. This is a still on the top from a Starsky and Hutch movie that came out around the same time, and I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, I don't really care about the movie, but I do love this thing in midair. It's an image that I wish I could make one, but I think at that point we were coming off of the era of overproduced images by people like Gregory Crutzen, where I think it left a certain bad taste, and I thought, well, there's no point in the future when I'll be able to put together what I would need to produce an image like that, but I was also attracted to films like this is a still from Mad Max on the bottom, which is a really dystopic and much more political movie that of which cars are a primary focus. So I would continue to kind of play with this subject. And I mean, really what I'm trying to say is I was a wannabe artist without a subject. And I knew that I loved photography, but I was just having a really hard time in this program where people were suddenly engaging with subject matter, whether it was themselves or something in the outside world, and then vectoring off from there. And the chair of that program is an artist named Nayland Blake, and they would not describe themselves as a photographer per se, and this is an older, well-known video work of Nayland's where they are wearing a bunny suit that is basically the weight of their ex-partner and dancing in that suit. And it shocked me. I mean, I was not completely unversed in conceptual and performative art at that point, but to have a relationship with, I had never had the kind of relationship that I could have with someone like Nayland, where we spent a lot of time together, and the kind of vulnerability that was required to produce something like that, and it was the next profound effect, I think, in my life from a teacher, from a faculty member, and totally antithetical to the teachings of someone like Shore, where really what he was saying is seeing is a way of thinking. And here's somebody who was saying, it's in the doing. You don't have to even make the picture. Maybe you should think about why you're photographing the thing, and let's talk about just bringing the thing in and forgetting about the photograph. And that tore all of these walls down. But it meant that in order to keep making pictures, I would have to be very disciplined about that desire. This is some of you might recognize this. This is a Moira Davey photograph made in her apartment of her own collection of records. And this is somebody else who was faculty there around the same time. And this was the way out of this overproduced, large format hangover that I think a lot of us were feeling from the 90s. It's accessible, it's physically small, so accessible in that way. You can reverse engineer it in your head. You have a sense of what she's looking at and where she's standing and the mechanics of that image. It's very difficult to look at something like a Gursky picture and try to reverse engineer that. You don't have a sense of the artist being confronted by the subject. And so this kind of almost de-skilled yet tender and authentic kind of photography I found really appealing, but I didn't yet have a way to employ it. This is just another, this is a series that Moira Davey made called the Copperheads, and essentially what she did was put pennies under a photocopy stand, photograph those pennies, and so you're looking at all the markings of life recorded on these pennies, and it's a conventional photo project, yet it's made on a 35mm film camera using a cheap copy stand, and so again, these materials are readily available and accessible. And I was looking at a lot of research-based artists like Tacita Dean, who were not known as photographers, but they engaged with a kind of research-based art making, become interested in a subject, how to engage with that subject, do you have access to that subject, and in what ways is that going to manifest into a work of art? This is very exciting to me. And so that led me to artists like James Welling, who were appealing to me partly because of their varied practice, but also because he would find a subject that he wanted to engage with and then sort of build the way in which he would make those pictures around that idea. So train photography, vernacular train photography, amateur train photography just suddenly became of interest to him. So embodying that style and that mindset, he went out and he authored his own train pictures. And then we get here, and this is a really defining moment for me. This is a selection of Roe Etheridge photographs, and I asked the gallery for installation shots from these two shows from, I believe, 2004 and 2005, and the gallery has updated its website a few times since these shows, and the original installation shots are on slides, and they don't have a scanner that can scan the slides, so those installation shots are impossible to make public in the way that we're used to in the moment. So anyway, I just cobbled this together from what I could find online. But what was exciting about it is that coming out of this period where, again, I think there was a real fatigue from the 90s with overproduced pictures, to suddenly be in a room again with somebody who, at first I didn't think it was possible that one person had made all of these pictures, that they could inhabit these different genres and styles of photography. Because I had always thought, well, you find your subject, and then you employ the method by which you're going to photograph or document that subject, and then it's just a process of honing. And here was somebody who, on the bottom left, figured out how to make bird photography, celestial photography, the moon pictures across the top, and studio portraiture, and who was also out in the world with her 4x5 camera. And it made me a little bit queasy. I felt kind of sick to my stomach looking at it, thinking, I didn't know that this was possible. I knew it was possible in a commercial platform or a commercial setting, but it just, and there are certainly precedents for this, but in that moment, I think I was struck by what a celebration it was of the tactical ability of that photographer, just the skill-based process by which he would make images. It thrilled me, and it reminded me of all of the things that I would discuss with Nayland about how, at the end of the day, I just love to see a picture framed on the wall, and it was hard for me to engage with somebody who didn't have the same visceral response when confronted with something like that. It's sort of like saying, do you like movies or not? If you don't like movies, this movie's not going to be for you. And so I made a lot of attempts to sort of emulate that with this subject matter. And, you know, these are, I'm showing you these. It feels a little bit embarrassing at this point. And this is the early 2000s, and it was sort of peak photo contest era, the era of photo blogs, the kind of pay-to-play era. And so there were a lot of, you know, contest shows and things like that. And I was sort of playing with this idea of the useless film still, the credit image, how to come back to narrative and not go back to the 90s to do it, but kind of employ the tools that I always found satisfying and comfortable with. And this is another installation shot from around that time. You can see there are things like pictures of airships, of a Hindenburg model and cowboys and stuff like that. And the car pictures are kind of going on the periphery. And then I started playing with model cars. And I thought, this makes sense to me because it means I can do it in my kitchen. I can buy a cheap car. I can light it with a table lamp, and I'm in that Moira Davey world now, where it's accessible, and I don't need means to make that picture within reason. And so I just went out on one of the streets near where I was living in Brooklyn one afternoon and just took some street pictures, pointing the camera up, hung one of these models on a string, I think it was just in my kitchen. It might have been this studio that we had access to at ICP-Bard. And I had to learn things about lighting and studio practice outside of school. And none of the schools that I went to were vocational in any way. And maybe I'll get to this more later, but this is, I got better at photographing the backgrounds, and so I got back to that place in the late 90s where I really could think about the structural integrity of a picture. So this is the studio setup now. It's a fairly humble setup. The car is hanging from a marionette arm on a tripod, and I light it with gels and strobes, and maybe there's seamless paper involved, and I'll have on the screen or a printout of a picture like this, and I'll just try to match the light. And there's a certain amount of post-production in Photoshop, of course. This is the camera. It is a Wista geared 4x5 camera. This is a picture of me working in the studio, concentrating. And I don't have much to show from the field, but I will say that on kind of a romantic note, I just like being by myself in a city late in the afternoon, waiting for the light to change. And you can see the 4x5 camera on the right. It's got the dark cloth wrapped around it, and the film holders are hanging from a bag, and it's a very light travel tripod for a smaller camera. And I can be discreet, and I can set it up quickly, and I find the process to be very therapeutic, and I look forward to making these once or twice a year. And it became, in that way, it became something that I would look forward to every, it's a tradition, is what I'm trying to say. This is an example of the car tests made in the studio. So they're shot on 4x5 film, and I'll change up the lighting, I'll give myself variation in exposure and color, and then I'll cut them all up, and then I'll scan them on a drum scanner. This is one of the rare times that more than one of these pictures was exhibited together. I never thought that I would make, when I made the first one, I didn't think I would make more than one. And so rarely have I agreed to show more than one, because I've always had this strange relationship with these pictures. And I think I'm at a point in my life now, which is something that I discussed with Leslie and Aperture a lot, was that these pictures have always worked to define me in my career, and I've tried to define myself against that, but I also wouldn't have the career that I have if it wasn't for these pictures. And so she said, look, if you can get to 25, let's talk about making a book. And I thought, you're right, 25 is a good number to kind of take stock, and so that's what we did. It is also, this is something that I say to students whenever I have the opportunity to teach, is that photography really can provide you with a set of experiences that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so shooting editorial commercial work is something that came out of, you could say, the slickness of the pictures that I was making. Because the language around photography often includes things like, people will say, well, that looks commercial, without knowing what it means to describe something as commercial. So I made a real effort to go out and learn commercial photography. And it meant that I would be out in the desert with crews of people photographing cars, people who believed that I knew something about photographing cars only because I had engaged with the subject matter in a very superficial way. But any opportunity you have to hone your craft, I think, is worthwhile. And the kind of ancillary commercial projects that I've done have really helped me to just love the process of making pictures. And I had worked for a long time to undo the kind of intuitive process by which I was making pictures. And when you're working commercially, you need to rely on intuition to a certain extent. You need to learn to make decisions. And I think it's important to let those sort of things in, and then you can feed them back into your art practice. There's a good one here in the bottom left. That is a raw steak on the grill of that car. And I'd made a book previously, and that book was sort of my love letter to photography. And it was a lonely process putting that book together. The publishers in Europe, I would send them PDFs. It took a number of years to be fully finished. And this book was a much more collaborative experience. This is a vector drawing that I made for Dior, and so I have let these pictures in an effort to sort of get behind them in a sense. I have been more welcoming to people who have wanted to see them used for other purposes. And so I made this drawing, which later became, which was based on this idea that some of the parts of the picture could be modular, and worked with Dior to make a series of luxury handbags, clutches, and keychains. And I mean, I will say honestly that this project has allowed me to, this work has allowed me to do other work. This is a still from the movie Pitch Perfect. The guy on the left is clearly wearing a shirt with my image on it, and that's a Levi's logo underneath it. Levi's doesn't know where this image came from, and I tried to investigate it for a while. This is a time almost before the internet, so all I could do was write messages on IMDb message boards and try to get my agent to look into it, and they felt like it was a conflict of interest with Levi's and didn't want to nag them. And so I never figured out what the provenance of this particular picture was. But if anybody is a copyright lawyer and wants to hang out afterwards and talk to me about it, I would love that. So this is the 25 pictures that I took to Aperture. And what I said was, look, I've been making these pictures for 15 years. I'd love to make a book out of them. I don't know what the book should be. I don't know how to shape it. And I'm looking for somebody to help guide me through that process. Let's make this process collaborative. I'm coming off a couple of years of just really trying to maintain a tight grip on the work that I was making and struggling to control that context and thinking, Aperture is an institution that I trust, and I'd love to experience that institution guiding me through the handling and care of this work. These are some early covers. Another thing I said was, I don't want this book, let's not pretend that it's something that it's not. There are a number of pretty heavy titles coming out in the spring, and so maybe this is where we take a breath, and let's find something that's both bold and vivid, but somewhat celebratory, and I'll figure out what I'm comfortable with in the process. And so here we are, sort of zooming in on, I said, please don't make this a cloth-bound cover with my name across the top, and I don't want it to be conservative in an elegant sense. This is another iteration, and then we took these two covers into the office and crowdsourced it, and anyway, there was a vote. And I thought the clear winner was the one on the right, and I think people picked the one on the left. But anyway, as the artist, I was allowed the swing vote. And so there it is. We also made a poster. Again, there is a almost modular quality to this work where I've become much more comfortable with the idea that it doesn't just have to be pictures on a wall. And I think some of that comes from a frustration with the gallery system and just wanting to feel like the work is something that I can employ in a number of different kinds of scenarios for different purposes. And in doing that, nothing is diminished. And the struggle that you have as an artist to confront that and to be comfortable with it, I think it's difficult and it's ongoing. But anyway, Aperture was very nice about making kind of ancillary things like posters to give out to people. So then Leslie and I talked about who should write the essay, and should it have an essay? Should there be an interview? Should there be text at all? And Leslie said, listen, I'll consider anyone, but Richard Prince. Please don't ask me to ask Richard Prince. And she said, well, what about Rachel Kushner? And the moment she said it, I was so jealous that she had come up with that. I wish that it was my idea because I thought it was, it really couldn't have been more perfect. I don't know how many of you have read The Flamethrowers, but Rachel Kushner starts a novel with images. And that narrative is organized around really just her trying to engage with that subject matter. That's obviously something that's really appealing to me. And that, and one of the characters in this book says to another character, art is a technique for inhabiting the world, and it's keeps you from dissolving into it. And that resonated with me, and I thought, well, this is somebody who understands the importance of images. So we reached out to her, and in the middle of our correspondence, the new book, The Mars Room, came out, and Rachel went dark for a couple of months while she was touring this book, and it was on the cover of every national book review and New York Times foldouts and all kinds of things. And I thought, well, that's it. I'll never hear from her again. She doesn't have time for my little project. And then she resurfaced again. And she is somebody who I think engages with her subject matter with a kind of authenticity that I don't have, that I can't bring to the subject matter. I don't own these cars, I don't drive them. I can only talk about them in sort of vague terms. And I liked that there was somebody involved in the project who would bring a level of authenticity to it, and it wasn't some guy doing burnouts in a parking lot upstate, to be honest. So, okay, got it. Okay, I just got the 5-minute warning. All right, so these are the, I thought I could just end by just going through the 25 images in the book. This one is made in Maine. This followed the one that I showed you in Brooklyn, and I think it was the first one that I made where I thought, oh, I like this. Something just clicked on a pictorial level. It had all of the sort of built-in romanticism and all of the kind of visual charge that I was looking for. It seemed to both world build, to use a kind of contemporary but also shore-like term, and also speak to a decisive moment. And over time, I tried to make the backgrounds. I got more and more into this idea of that the sun had to be setting, that the cars, the images had to be backlit. You had to be looking into the sun. Some of these sort of midday ones were earlier, where I hadn't quite figured out what worked yet. Another thing about that Roe Etheridge period is that what everyone was really talking about was working non-serially. And so that was kind of the leading edge of, I think, a lot of what was happening in the fine art photo community at the time. And again, while this parallel contest world is going on, a lot of us could not apply to these things because if you could pay a certain amount of money for a series, or you had to pay for individual images. So you'd apply with your series, and someone would write you back and say, "This isn't a series. This is clearly 5 or 6 individual images." And that always stuck in my mind as a moment where the photography world is so fractured right now, and I worked so hard to avoid working serially, and really these pictures are almost operate like a typology. I think you have to remember that these automobiles they're quite brutal in reality to drive or ride in them, the way that they're marketed, the space that they occupy culturally. But they're also something else. They're unions, and they're towns, and they're a certain kind of peak design and ideology. They're actually quite complex. And then to see one, I think, like I said, it is like looking at something, some of them anyway, that you just can't believe existed in the same timeline that we're in. This one I made because one of the galleries I work with said, listen, I know you think they're different, but a lot of people don't think they're different. So can you make one at night? And I got very angry. And don't tell me what to do. And yeah, okay, I can try to make one at night. Yeah. And then this one is black and white, which brings it all back to that first image. Okay. Thanks.